sick of here. Yes, is that good, that? That's better. 2 empty shells. There are a lot there, aren't there?
Stories of the cockle fishing are legion, like the one about the man who caught his weight in cockles, but found he couldn't lift his catch, and he watched his boat drifting away from him onto a far horizon. Traditionally, the day's harvest is always prepared fresh, cooked on the sea where the catch was made, while waiting for the tide to flood, or else on the way back into port.
Can you actually cook them in here?
That is cooking them. That's cooking them.
It's a good soupy smell, actually, isn't it?
Very good.
It'll come out quite easy then.
Oh, yes, come out well.
Are they ready to eat now?
No, we've got to go wash it. There'll be a bit of sand. There'll be a bit of sand in them. A little bit of sand in them. Not a lot.
Yeah, how do you get that out?
Wash them.
Oh.
In a washing room.
There's a certain art in Alan Pordham's skill with the washing ring. 10 deft turns through a rising tide, and not a single morsel missing. Thanks to archaeological research, we know that the Romans in Britain shared our taste in shellfish. At the time of the grain run, the wash was awash with oyster beds. But at that time, the wash wasn't quite like this.
The scenery of the grain run has shifted considerably since the Roman occupation of Britain. And if the Romans were to come back now, they wouldn't know the place. We're heading into the haven, the sheltered mouth of the River Witham, and in Roman times, this cut between the high green banks on either side wouldn't have been here at all. In Roman times, all this was open sea.
The mapping of ancient coastlines is a risky business, and it's doubtful whether a definitive coastline can be interpreted at any precise period in history. But we know for certain that the distant port of Boston was once the gateway to the Wash, and we presume that just 300 years ago the land stopped here. The granite memorial is a clue to Boston's special place in history. These days it's a 7-mile journey up the haven and into Boston. The day's catch is cooled and ready for the pallet before we get there.
Would you like one of these?
I'd like to try them. I think one first, yes. Oh, lovely.
Should be, they just come out of sand, don't they?
So they're a mellow taste, aren't
Never get them any
Mellow.
fresher. I'll try them.
Actually, they are a very mellow taste. Sometimes you get them a bit sharp, don't you? Is that...
That's the vinegar and the acid and that they keep them in nowadays. Them straight out the sand, you see, they're fresh, aren't they?
Yeah. Are they good for you?
They're supposed to be good for your sex life, but I don't know, nobody's proved it.
At one time, Boston was the premier port of England. In the 13th century, her docks and quays yielded up more customs dues than even those of the Port of London. Today, it's a tiny fraction. It's in Boston that we say goodbye to the Terence G.
Right, thanks, John. Cheers.
Despite all the 20th century redevelopment, there's still a lot of the old town left, and it's well worth looking at. Some of the redevelopment preserves the exterior. A former grain warehouse becomes a music centre. Blackfriars, the 13th century Dominican priory, is now a theatre. Fidel House remains one of the finest 18th century houses in England. The Guildhall is now a museum. This fine building of Dutch brick was built in 1450.
It wasn't until 150 years later that Boston Guildhall really passed into contemporary history. It was in 1630 that a group who sought religious freedom attempted to leave England. They were arrested in Boston, brought to this courtroom, where they were detained and led down here. These steps lead to the cells where the group who later became known as the Pilgrim Fathers were incarcerated. It's amazing to think that 7 men were kept in 2 cells the size of this one while awaiting their trial at Lincoln Assizes.
The hustle and bustle of contemporary life make it difficult to imagine that Boston's most famous landmark predates the Pilgrim Fathers. Standing at the west end of St. Botolph's, the largest parish church in England, is the best place from which to appreciate the great height of the Boston Stump. The keystone, reputed to weigh some 6 tons, is 137 feet above the floor, a height only exceeded by the vault above the span in Liverpool Cathedral. The Boston Stump is one of the finest medieval lantern towers in England. The view from the summit repays the climb. South past that granite memorial marking the place where the pilgrims were first arrested. North, our way ahead, the way the Romans carried the grain. That was before the Boston Grand Sluice, built to terminate the tide and help control the flood. When the Witham was in flood, it was apparently impossible to tell where the Witham was. It looked more like a lake than a river. Previous high water marks are recorded on the base of the Boston Stump.
This is the Sarah Whitby, our craft for the next 40 miles or so from here on till the River Trent. But of course, we haven't finished with Boston yet. There's a lot more to see here by water than you might think. And the Sarah Whitby is an ideal vessel for this purpose. Her skipper's Alan Thompson. Morning, Alan.
Good morning, Pete. Come aboard.
Thank you.
The best step lively though because the tide's going out.
Oh, right.
With the help of our crew, Nicky and Tony, we cast off and head north through the sluice while we're on the tide. The efficiency of the Boston Grand Sluice belies its age. This intricate locking system first opened over 200 years ago. Over the centuries, the operating mechanism has been modernized, automated, but the principle remains the same. Gravity does the work. What's particularly interesting about the Boston Sluice is that unlike most tidal locks, the sea gates, doors as they call them locally, have to be used at every tide. Twice a day the doors close automatically to keep the rising water out. Once we're through the second set of doors, we're safe.